I want to turn now to the war in Ukraine. President Trump, as you know, held talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin to try to broker a peace deal. Putin agreed to stop bombing energy and infrastructure targets. But what will it take for a lasting peace in Ukraine? We want to welcome back in former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, this morning, currently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador, it's good to talk to you once again. President had this call this morning, and there seem to be conflicting reports on what the result of this will be. So was this a good week or a bad week in the effort to draw this war to a close?
So, Tom, it's great to be back with you. Yeah, I think there's some progress here. It has got to be a good thing that the two sides are talking to someone, and they're talking to the Americans. As you said, President Trump and President Zelensky had a good discussion, and they agreed on a general ceasefire. A general ceasefire across the board, air, sea, land, and they took that, President Trump and the Americans took that to the Russians, and President Putin said no. President Putin said no. He has some conditions and strings and nuances, he calls them, and he would only agree to a ceasefire on energy facilities, energy infrastructure, a much narrower ceasefire than what President Trump and President Zelensky had proposed. So nonetheless, this week, they'll have some more conversations in Saudi Arabia and try to make some progress, at least on this infrastructure ceasefire, and then move on to bigger things.
You know, it's pretty clear President Trump wants peace in this war. He stated it repeatedly. But it also is going to require concessions on both sides. Are we dealing with two sides of this war that are in any interest in giving up any concessions?
We've not seen any indication that the Russians are willing to give anything up. They occupy, Tom, about 18% of Ukraine's territory. And they've not indicated any flexibility on those negotiations, those considerations. President Zelensky, on the other hand, has recognized grudgingly that he's not going to be able to take back that 18% that the Russians illegally occupy by military force. President Zelensky has recognized that. He, by the way, Tom, is never going to recognize the Russians' annexation of that 18%. He will never recognize that, but he might be willing to agree to a ceasefire and an eventual settlement with the idea that they'll take it back someday, but they're not going to take it back militarily. So that's a...
Yeah. So, Ambassador, just to stay on that for a moment, what would that look like? Would it remain part of Ukraine with Russian troops as some kind of peacekeeping force or whatever they want to call it? Or would that be annexed by Russia itself?
The Russians would say it would be annexed, and the Ukrainians would say, no, it's still an occupied part of Ukraine. And likely, Tom, the whole international community, or at least the West, and certainly the United States, would agree that would agree not to recognize, would refuse to recognize Russian annexation, legal annexation, recognized annexation of that part of Ukraine territory. That would be a major concession to the Russians and a violation of international law. So I don't see that happening. But so, as you say, the Russians would de facto occupy that 18%, and the Ukrainians would try to get that back over time diplomatically.
And quickly, I got to ask you, Ambassador, you were former vice president of the American Institute for Peace. There was an incident this past week here in the District of Columbia where a Doge team entered the building. D.C. police were involved. Your reaction to that?
So there'll be a legal dispute, Tom, and a legal discussion, and they're in court. They've already been to court. They're going to go back. The question is whether or not the Institute of Peace is under the jurisdiction of Doge, and the Institute of Peace argues, I think correctly, that Congress set them up. And Congress did not put them in the executive branch. So the Institute of Peace, United States Institute of Peace, is outside of the executive branch, reports to the Congress. Now, the president does nominate the directors, and the Senate confirms them, right. But the Congress funds it.
Yeah. Ambassador William Taylor, always a pleasure to speak with you, sir. We appreciate your time.